Risk is always a part of life and a part of fantasy football. For example, last year I won $15,000 in one fantasy draft, placing fourth place out of 14,000 total players using the heavy wide receiver strategy, a very risky draft strategy. And today I'm going to show you how we can use that draft strategy in 2025 and if we even should use it at all in 2025 fantasy football. So just make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support if you get value from the video today, which I know you will, because as I just said, I used the wide receiver heavy draft strategy to win $15,000 and place fourth place in a fantasy football draft last year. So you might ask me, well, what is the wide receiver heavy draft strategy? Well, it's very similar to how it sounds, right? Wide receivers are going to be your primary target very early and very often in the early rounds of your fantasy football draft. Typically, you want to get 5 wide receivers by round 7 in this type of draft strategy right here, because a lot of the times, these wide receivers, particularly an underdog, are going to go off the board really fast. So to get this heavy wide receiver draft strategy to hit right, you want to make sure you get 5 by round 7. And the most important, I think, factor of a wide receiver heavy draft strategy is you must hit on your 2 running backs. Your first 2 running backs that you get to your team, they've got to be hits right out of the gate. There is very little room for error here, hence the big risk with this particular draft strategy. Now, I think it's also really important to note that a lot of people will utilize this draft strategy, particularly with a 0 running back strategy as well. A lot of people will go into their draft and say, you know what, I'm going to avoid running backs. But sometimes they get a quarterback early or a tight end early. A heavy wide receiver draft strategy, you don't really want to do that since you're already going to be delaying your running back process more than most teams will. But some people do utilize a wide receiver heavy strategy with a 0 running back strategy. So why does this work, right? Why did it work for me? Well, first of all, the reason it does work is because you hammer top wide receiver upside early in drafts. And most of the time, the wide receivers who are going to be finishing inside the top 12, inside the top 15, are going to be guys that you're going to get within the first 5 rounds, within the first 6 rounds, within the first 7 rounds, right? These are going to be early to mid-round wide receivers that are going to be at the top of fantasy football in each year. So you're basically filling out your wide receivers with elite level play. You're also going to fill out your flex positions as well as your wide receiver positions with elite wide receiver play. And again, I cannot stress this enough. It only works if you hit on your top 2 running backs here. Because by the time you pick a 3rd running back, it's going to be mid to late rounds in your fantasy football drafts. So those 2 first running backs that get on your team, they better be hitting for you. So I want to first go through the first 7 picks of this fantasy football draft that I did last year, just to kind of show you what this team makeup looked like and where I went in this draft last year. So the first 2 picks were wide receivers. I went with Amon-Ra St. Brown and then Nico Collins. So Amon-Ra St. Brown obviously did very well last year, as he has always done. So I figured to myself, you know, I've got a guy who's going to be very consistently a top 5, top 7 wide receiver in fantasy football. I'm going to go for gold here and try to hit on a league winner I thought last year with Nico Collins. And Nico Collins, for those of you who played last year, know that he was a very good wide receiver in fantasy football when he was on the field. The problem was he just missed time due to injury. That was really the big drawback with Nico Collins. But the bottom line is, on a fantasy points per game basis, Nico Collins was one of the best wide receivers in fantasy. Then I went with my first running back, who again, it hit. Derrick Henry in the 3rd round. Imagine getting Derrick Henry in the 3rd round this year. It'd be pretty awesome. But Derrick Henry in the 3rd round last year was viewed as a risky pick at the time, and it was a pick that I was all over. Derrick Henry was probably one of my top 10 most drafted backs last year, and I'm very happy that I did it with this draft because, again, those first 3 picks, they hit really well. Then I went with my 3rd wide receiver, T. Higgins, in the 4th round. Now, again, T. Higgins last year was much more desirable in fantasy football drafts to me than he is this year, because T. Higgins is going a round earlier, sometimes 2 rounds earlier in fantasy football drafts this year. And I think at this fourth round value that I got him at, I felt a lot more comfortable going with him as my third wide receiver than as my second or my first wide receiver off the board, because I knew that T. Higgins would have down weeks as well, and he would not be a stable producing guy as I would get with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Nico Collins, two wide receiver ones on their own teams. But given that I got him as my wide receiver 3, it gave me major upside, especially in week 17 when it mattered most. So I'm very happy with T. Higgins there. Then I got my second running back in the 5th round with Josh Jacobs. Again, imagine getting Josh Jacobs in the 5th round. Like, that was a great value last year that I was all over once again. One of my top 10 most drafted backs, probably top 5. Josh Jacobs, I was all over his value last year. And again, he was a top 5 back in half PPR. So that kind of reiterates my point right there. With Derrick Henry and with Josh Jacobs, those two running backs that I got in the 3rd and the 5th round, they were both top 5 backs in a half PPR format. You cannot miss on your first two running backs because, again, as you can see, the rest of my 2 picks in the first 7 rounds were Ladd McConkey and Jackson Smith-Njigba, giving me 5 wide receivers through the first 7 rounds and not a running back to be seen after Josh Jacobs. So this is extremely important to hit on those 2 running backs. And with Ladd McConkey and Jackson Smith-Njigba, I went into it with a very similar mentality, which was that I wanted to maximize 2 younger talents at the wide receiver position that I had personal belief in and I thought were being undervalued. And it turns out I was right on both of them again. Ladd McConkey ends up hitting in a big way at a great value. And same with Jackson Smith-Njigba. They're both top 15 wide receivers in fantasy football last year in a half PPR format. So it worked out really well. These first 7 picks, there was not a miss on the board. Now, here's, I think, where it really worked particularly well. Aside from the fact that all those players hit, the reason I think it worked so well is because when you look at the amount of wide receivers that were going off the board in 2024 fantasy football and how many of them were going fast enough, like within the first 3, 5, 7 rounds, it made me want to go attack the position here. So there was 35 wide receivers that were gone by the end of round 5 in 2024 fantasy football on Underdog. So again, at the end of round 5, you're getting into wide receiver 4 territory, which is not particularly what I wanted to do if I was just grabbing my wide receiver 2, for example, or even my wide receiver 3. I wanted to make sure I had 3 wide receivers inside the top 24, inside the top 30 of these rankings. And then 46 wide receivers were gone by the end of round 7. So after that, you're taking shots on really late round guys. Guys who in all likelihood are not going to be this year's Ladd McConkey, this year's Jackson Smith-Njigba. So there was 3 big takeaways that I think that we should come away with here. Number 1 being that I attacked wide receivers. As I just said, I looked at the ADP, and I was well aware of this at the time, how many wide receivers were going inside the first 5 rounds, inside the first 7 rounds. So I wanted to utilize this strategy and say to myself, hey, I've got to go get 5 wide receivers by the end of round 7, because by the time I get to round 8, 46 wide receivers are going to be gone. So I want to attack wide receivers right here. And I also prioritized value picks right here, because as I just went through, T. Higgins in the 4th round was a great value, as it was displayed last year, and now he's going in the 3rd and sometimes the 2nd round. Josh Jacobs in the 5th round was an excellent value, going in the 2nd, 3rd round this year. Derrick Henry in the 3rd round, going at the 1-2 turn basically in fantasy drafts this year. I was prioritizing value at certain positions in this particular draft. And I also, lastly, used a strategy with historical success that I could track very easily. So what I'm going to show you right here is this tool on RotoViz. I really like to use this tool because it gives you the historical success rates of certain draft strategies rounds 1 through 5 and making it to your playoffs, to the semifinals, and to the finals in underdog best ball tournaments, particularly Best Ball Mania. So what I did the first 5 rounds, as we just went through, was I went wide receiver 1 in round 1, wide receiver 2 in round 2, running back 1 in round 3, wide receiver 3 in round 4, and running back 2 in round 5. Now what you can see at the bottom here is numbers attached to these positional advancement rates. So what you can see is that 21.4% of these teams with this particular build since 2021 made it to the playoffs. Now that's a great number right there, because what you actually start at before you draft anybody, your initial advancement percentage rate is about 16%, because only 2 out of 12 teams in a particular fantasy football pool on Underdog will make it to the playoffs. So I increased my chances by about 5% within the first 5 rounds of making it to the playoffs. 1.62% of these teams made it to the semifinals. Again, that's a very strong number right there. And to make it to the finals, you had a 0.16% chance of making it to the finals. Again, very strong number. Most of the finals advancement rate numbers are in the 0.0 numbers. So in this 0.16 range, I had a very strong chance of making it just based on utilizing this draft strategy. And again, I was well aware of how strong this draft strategy was, what the historical advancement rates were before I ended up drafting this team. So let's go through the full roster right now. So what you can see on the screen is obviously we already touched on the first 7 picks. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Nico Collins, Derrick Henry, T. Higgins, Josh Jacobs, Ladd McConkey, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. Then in round 8, I went with the great value of the draft, in my opinion, Joe Burrow at the quarterback position to give me the stack of Cincinnati players, T. Higgins and Joe Burrow. I love taking Joe Burrow at this range because not only is it giving me a great value at quarterback, but I'm also not waiting too late to grab kind of a lower tier quarterback. And obviously worked out great with Burrow. But the fact of the matter was I was trying to get a stacked quarterback, number one, and also trying to get a high-end quarterback that was going late enough but had top 5 quarterback upside. And again, it hit very well. I also took Brock Bowers in the 9th round, which ended up being a fantastic pick. I mean, he was the tight end 1 in fantasy football last year. So again, I came back right after taking my 5th wide receiver and rounded out all my position groups, having at least one of them. I took my quarterback and then I took my tight end. But as you can see here, this is the reason why it was so important that my 2 running backs hit, because I did not take another running back until Tyjae Spears in the 10th, who was largely ineffective for the majority of the season, except in the playoff run where he was extraordinarily key for this particular team right here. Because Derrick Henry had some rough playoff games in fantasy football last year. Tyjae Spears came in and filled that void at the perfect time like he had not done all season long. But again, had I not hit on those top 2 running backs, it would not have mattered because Tyjae Spears would not have carried me. Then I went Dontavian Wicks in the 11th round. Now, Dontavian Wicks had his up and down moments, mostly down moments in 2024, but Dontavian Wicks did give me some upside weeks in the middle part of the season of 2024. So I was happy with some of those weeks, but really largely just kind of an ineffective player in the 11th round. Could have went with somebody better, like a Jerry Jeudy who went a little bit after Dontavian Wicks. But that's in hindsight. Then I went with Justin Herbert in the 12th round to round out my quarterback position. And again, give me another stack with Ladd McConkey, which, by the way, had I not had Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert still had a great Week 17 performance. But again, Joe Burrow carried the water most of the time in the 2024 regular fantasy football season. Then I went with Jalen Wright, who had upside at the time in this fantasy football range, but it did not work. Jalen Wright did not work. So again, my next 2 running backs, they were largely pretty big busts in the 2024 season, but it didn't matter that much because I had Henry and I had Jacobs at great values in the draft. Then I rounded out my tight end position with Tyler Conklin, who again, mostly irrelevant, but he came through in Week 17 at a big moment. Then I grabbed Malachi Corley, wanted the upside, did not get it. Tyrone Tracy Jr. wanted the upside with an ambiguous backfield, and I got it. Tyrone Tracy Jr. became my RB3 and a consistent flex for my team if one of my wide receivers did not have a great week. Tyrone Tracy Jr. became a huge factor in that winning team right there. DJ Chark in the 17th round did not hit, but I liked the big play upside, but it did not hit. Deneric Prince, again, liked the upside pick, did not work out. But this was the draft that I had that was 4th out of 14,000 total teams in fantasy football last year to give me a $15,000 winning team. So obviously I was very happy with that upside. But will it work again in 2025? Because really at the end of the day, that's all that's going to matter here, is if it works in 2025. I believe it will, and I believe it won't at the same time. So the reason I think it will work, if you utilize it correctly, is because the ADP is actually a little bit more favorable for wide receivers, particularly early in the draft. So last year, like I said, 24 wide receivers were gone by round 3 in fantasy football drafts. Well, this year it's only 18. So there is a definite evening out point that we're seeing right now in fantasy football drafts on Underdog, where these running backs and these wide receivers, the running backs are kind of creeping up to the level of wide receivers, making it a little bit more balanced and making you able and capable of getting higher end wide receivers within the first 3 rounds, like you were not able to last year. You could get 3 wide receivers inside the top 18 in the first 3 rounds if you wanted to go wide receiver, wide receiver, wide receiver right out of the gate. The reason it won't work is because, again, this is a highly risky draft strategy. There is no getting around the risk factor here of if you don't hit on those 2 running backs. You saw in my draft that my next 2 running backs were complete and utter busts. They fell on their face. The only reason it worked is because my first 2 running backs in round 3 and 5, they ended up hitting. So you have to hit on those first 2 running backs, because it probably will be a little while before you go with a 3rd running back. So what I want to do here is I want to put things into action, and I want to go through 3 drafts that I've done in 2025 that are very similar or exactly the same almost as the draft I did last year, to see how we end up liking the teams of each of these particular draft positions. So the first team I want to go through, I did at the 109, and I grabbed Amon-Ra St. Brown in the first round and Brian Thomas Jr. in the second round. So with these 2 guys, like I said, I think Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be very similar play of last year. I think he'll be very consistent. He's a safe pick at this range. He's got top 5 upside, top 3 upside potentially. And I think that this is a great play to make at the back of your first round this year. Brian Thomas Jr., I think, also has tremendous upside. It will be capped this year with Travis Hunter getting targets, but Brian Thomas Jr. still does have top 7 wide receiver upside. So if both these guys hit, I'm going to be really happy with 2 top 10 wide receivers inside the first 2 rounds. Then I grabbed Jackson Smith-Njigba and Mike Evans here in the 3rd and the 4th round. So with Jackson Smith-Njigba, I'm also very on board. I think this is a very safe pick, a definite top 15 wide receiver, but I think personally has top 10 upside this year. I have no problem with him as my wide receiver 3. In fact, I'm really happy with him as my wide receiver 3. Mike Evans is my wide receiver 4, is boom or bust. We will see if that one ends up working out or not over time. Is Father Time here for him this year? Is he not here for him? But either way, as my wide receiver 4, I feel great about it. Then I grabbed Jalen Waddle in the 5th as my wide receiver 5. So the difference between last year's draft and what I did in this one was I went wide receiver through round 5. 5 wide receivers through the first 5 rounds. Now, that one is actually interesting because in 2023, the big money winner who won $2 million in first place in Best Ball Mania, he actually used that draft strategy. Went wide receiver all 5 picks. So I kind of utilized that a little bit, and I'm curious to see how it works out because I went with DeAndre Swift and Aaron Jones as my first 2 running backs in the 6th and the 7th round. So again, I'm going to need to hit one way or the other on these 2 running backs. And DeAndre Swift, I feel better about than I do with Aaron Jones. I think Aaron Jones on a per game basis could be a really good contributor for you, but at the same time, I don't think that he's going to be consistent. I think there's going to be a lot of bust weeks with Aaron Jones, and that's going to be a problem here because Aaron Jones is definitely not a guy who is going to give you tons of consistency in 2025. So again, not feeling super confident about that running back tandem, but I hope it works. Then I went ahead and just grabbed 2 quarterbacks back-to-back to round it out. I grabbed Baker Mayfield and Jared Goff. So what I did here, again, I grabbed the stack quarterbacks. Baker Mayfield to stack with Mike Evans and Jared Goff to stack with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Both these guys, in my opinion, have top 5 quarterback upside. I went ahead and rounded out the position. Then I grabbed Tyler Warren at tight end in the 10th round. But again, what you see here is that through 10 rounds, I've got 2 running backs. So those 2 guys, they've got to hit. and I don't particularly feel super confident about that one. So I'm not going to tell you that this was my favorite draft right here. The next draft, I liked it a little bit better. So I was at the 108 in this particular draft, and I grabbed Puka Nacua at the 108, and then A.J. Brown in the second round. So with Puka Nacua, there's obviously concerns right now about Matt Stafford's injury. But as long as Matt Stafford is out there, he will be a very good wide receiver in fantasy football. Someone who has top 3 wide receiver upside, in my opinion. So I'm praying that Matt Stafford is available and with us as soon as week 1 hits and throughout the rest of the season. A.J. Brown, I'm well aware that he will bust in certain weeks. But I'm also well aware that he will have boom weeks as well. And that's what I'm going for in this particular range. Because I have a stable wide receiver 1 with Puka. I want that massive upside that I could get from A.J. Brown. 30, 35 plus point weeks from A.J. Brown is what you could get. That's what I was going for. Because then I grabbed Devontae Adams at the wide receiver 3, who again, Los Angeles Rams wide receiver. Let's see if Matt Stafford plays. But of course you knew later in the draft, by the way, I grabbed Matt Stafford to stack with him. So I need Matt Stafford to play in this one to make this whole baby work. And then in round 4 and 5, I grabbed my running backs, Amari Hampton and Kenneth Walker. Now with this one in particular, this one looks like a great fit. If Matt Stafford plays, all those Rams wide receivers are going to be good. And then I got Amari Hampton in the 4th, who, by the way, has risen to the 3rd round because of the Najee Harris injury. So Amari Hampton could turn out to be an enormous value in the 4th round. I feel really good about that. And I also feel great about Kenneth Walker as my running back 2 in the 5th round. I think Kenneth Walker is someone who has running back 5 upside this year if he's able to stay healthy, which I know is a tall task for him. But in Clint Kubiak's offense, I love having Kenneth Walker as my running back 2. Then I went ahead and grabbed Deebo Samuel in the 6th, Matthew Golden in the 7th. Again, got 5 wide receivers through the first 7 rounds right here and 2 running backs. So I get Deebo Samuel as my wide receiver 4. Lots of upside with that player. And Matthew Golden, who I think obviously has wide receiver 1 potential in Green Bay's offense. Not in fantasy, but in Green Bay's offense, which will apply for some really big weeks in fantasy football. Then I grabbed my 3rd running back in round 8 this time. I grabbed Jaylen Warren at that 3rd running back spot. Somebody who I've discussed a lot this offseason, has a lot of utility in an Aaron Rodgers offense, who is a thrower to the running back, and also a guy who fit my unsuspecting league-winning running backs criteria. Bo Nix at quarterback here, and then Tyler Warren at the tight end in rounds 9 and 10. So now let's look at the last draft that I did from the 111 right here. So I grabbed Amon-Ra St. Brown and Nico Collins in the first 2 rounds. Again, similar to last year, I grabbed those 2 as my first 2 wide receivers. One of them has really high upside with Nico, and one of them is going to be really safe inside the top 6. So I feel really good about that. Then I grabbed Breece Hall in the 3rd and Amari Hampton again in the 4th round. So I feel really good about the RB2, not as great about the RB1 with Breece Hall. This is boom or bust right here. So again, he's got to hit for me in a big way if this one's going to end up working out. Jordan Addison in the 5th, Deebo Samuel in the 6th, and Josh Downs in the 7th. So again, I have 2 really high upside wide receivers right here with Jordan Addison and Deebo. And then I've got someone who is going to be a wide receiver 1 on his own team in Indianapolis, who I think is going to provide pretty good capability and consistency for me as a flex option, and maybe an occasional boom week. Then I grabbed Jordan Mason as my running back 3 in the 8th round. Again, love the utility here with Jordan Mason as a goal line back in one of the best offenses in football, with one of the best offensive minds in the NFL with Kevin O'Connell. I like having Jordan Mason here as my RB3 in round 8. Then I grabbed Jared Goff to stack with Amon-Ra, and I grabbed Evan Ingram as my tight end 1 right here. So I think these last 2 drafts that I did, I think those are better than the first one that I did. But again, we will see what happens, and I'm kind of curious to hear what y'all think about these 2 drafts right here. Because as I discussed, this is an extremely risky strategy right here. If you do not hit on those 2 running backs, it's over. It will not matter if your wide receivers that you picked inside the 7 rounds are going to be good or not. If your wide receivers are great, but those first 2 running backs suck, your team is going to get tanked because you won't have stable running back production every single week from those 2 top RB spots. So you have to hit on those 2 running backs here. But again, I think I've displayed what the payout and what the payoff can be if you end up hitting. $15,000 in one fantasy football tournament. And by the way, I won $19,000 playing underdog last year, got 20th place for $500 in another underdog draft, and I also got $3,500 in NFL playoff best ball. So yes, it is risky, but at the end of the day, everything in life is a risk, and the only way you're going to win big is if you risk it. So if you do want to give yourself a shot at winning this type of money, it's life-changing, man. And the good thing is Underdog is offering something awesome right now. Just go down the comments, there's a link there to go to Underdog, and you can use code FFN to sign up. And they'll match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus credits. They will literally throw free money at you to go get in on these Underdog tournaments and give yourself a shot at winning the big money, which again, I think you should do because I just did it last year. So let me know what you think of the wide receiver heavy draft strategy in 2025. And if you want to see what the smartest drafters are doing about the double hero running back strategy this year, click on this video right here.